Hello? Anyone there?
Hi,
Hello.
buddy.
Hey, what page in the source book is it?
It's page
170.
170.
Thank you. So, okay. Order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood. From my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood. From my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood. From my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. Whatever the virtues of the many fields of knowledge, all are steps on the path of omniscience. May these arise in the clear mirror of intellect, O Manjushri. Please accomplish this. Good evening and welcome. We continue our exploration of right view in the Buddhist tradition, and how what we think infiltrates what we believe. And today we delve into this a wonderful article by Jan Westerhoff, that many of us have seen before, if not once, maybe twice or three times. So some of us have been around the block with this wonderful piece of literature a number of times. And in this chapter, we have a very helpful presentation of the different aspects of the ways that one might consider things to be. And I'll try to paint the outline of what's presented and ask Chris to chime in and give details. And I have some notes here that I'm going to look at of things that I found interesting, as well as the overall structure. And the author repeats what we've seen before, is that this idea of swabhava, the term rather, was never used in the sutras by the Buddha. The early sutras recorded, attributed rather, to the Buddha, and is rare in the entire Pali Canon, by which he means the, uh, in addition to the sutras, the Abhidharma. It's often translated as inherent existence or own being, and as we all know, it's the main culprit against for Madhyamikas, and in general for Buddhists. We have a bit of a hang up with this idea of inherent existence. The difficulty in understanding Swabhava is that it's used very differently in different traditions. It itself is, because it's sort of vacuous, it is presented inconsistently, and it's very hard to create a defensible philosophical theory of what it is which I find is a really interesting point of like, um, there's basically the whole evolution of Buddhist thought revolves around this idea that things exist or not, and if they exist, there must be something, some way in which they exist, or something by virtue of which we can say that they exist. And it's very hard to come up with a defensible theory of what that means. Chris and I try to meet each week before class, and we went back to our 8-part atom and tried to like construct how do you get from an atom which has 8 dharmas, one of each of the major types, the 4 elements, and the 4 secondary derivatives being the objects of the 4 of the 5 senses. How do you get from there to phenomena of different types, like fire and water? And theoretically, a fire atom will, in addition to the core 8 atoms, have a lot more fire dharmas. And then the question is, how do do fire dharmas always give birth to fire dharmas? And how does that happen? And as dharmas go through different, as the elements go through different states, like fire goes from a presence, a sort of a capability to an actuality. Is there a change in the atom or in the number of atoms of fire dharmas in the substance in question? And as water goes from ice to liquid to steam, how do we describe that in terms of dharmas? So that's one problem. The other problem is that it's very hard to come up with a coherent, a specific group of people that have a coherent presentation of what they think Swabhava is. And so what we often hear about, and is largely true, is that those who complain about Swabhava, which we generally call Madhyamakas, they basically project a certain way of understanding Swabhava onto their other people or other traditions. Westerhoff divides Swabhava into three parts: an ontological dimension, a cognitive dimension, and a semantic dimension. And he focuses on the first two here, in particular the ontological dimension. He goes through the semantic dimension in a different chapter. And he tries to present how these hang together and what a viable defense or presentation of Swabhava might be, and why that why one would like consider that there is such a thing as Swabhava, which is sort of an interesting question. On the one hand, it's like, well, if things exist, they have to exist by virtue of something. But then there's the difficulty of defining that. Chris, do you want to give like very quick little descriptions, explanations that differentiate ontological, cognitive, and semantic?
Sure, yeah. So the ontological dimension is, I think, what we've been discussing a lot of this time, the idea of a ground, some sort of metaphysical ground of the world that we can use as a basis for our theories of how the world is. So when we put our feet on the ground and we stand up on it, there's something there, or so we think, that's holding us up. In modern parlance, we talk about this as being, some sort of subatomic particle. Um, for the Abhidharmakas, it were the Dharmas. Various other traditions have proposed different forms of this, but the idea is that um, there has to be some sort of ontological bottom for the world on which it rests, on which it's built out of. Um, so then we have the cognitive dimension, which is different and relates a lot to how our minds are structured, um, how we tend to concretize the world. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing ontology when we do that, but there is the sort of a default cognitive bias to separate the world into discrete entities. Most important in the Buddhist analysis is the discrete entity of the self, that we take all of the sense impressions and the mind and concretize that into a thing called me. And it may not be necessarily philosophically elaborate, um, but nevertheless, it is a very convincing cognitive bias that seems built into how our minds work, and from which we project out a philosophical idea, such as Swabhava. And we could say that one of the reasons that the philosophical notion of Swabhava is so difficult to form into something comprehensive is because it's not really coming primarily out of argumentation, but coming out of an implicit bias that we all walk around with. And that this dimension is very much connected with the notion of path. That in practicing Madhyamaka, what we're not necessarily doing. The project of Madhyamaka is not like a theoretical pursuit in its entirety, but it's using a theoretical understanding and the practice of meditation to help disentangle us from this implicit cognitive superimposition that we make. And then finally, we have a linguistic dimension, which, as Derek mentioned, was not covered in this chapter, and which I'll only cover briefly. But the idea is that the general consensus about how language works is that there is the world out there, and then we have a system of language that relates with it in some sort of structural way. And that's how language has meaning. So we could say that this shirt is red. And what that means, what the statement of that means, is that there's a state of affairs in the world, this red shirt, and then there's a sentence, the shirt is red, and that those two bear a certain structural similarity to one another. So that structural similarity doesn't have anything to do with whether or not anyone is thinking it, or it's mind independent in a way. But what makes the sentence "the shirt is red" it has nothing to do with what we're thinking about, but simply the existence of a red shirt in the world. And obviously, that sort of conception is predicated on a belief in a real world, which the Madhyamaka is going to say is predicated on a belief in Swabhava. And so what that means is the Madhyamaka is using language in a different way than sort of the general view. The Madhyamaka is using language much more in line with this idea of illusionism, that language can be used and can be useful and communicate without necessarily having a strong relationship with a real existing world. But for the most part, this chapter focuses on the ontological dimension, the dimension of Swabhava as a theory of how the world might be. So, Derek, do you want to walk us through the three definitions that he gives of the ontological dimension?
Yes. So thank you for that, Chris. And so the way that I try to understand his presentation of the three that you just went through is that he calls them what dimensions, three dimensions. So these are not three different types of swabhava. There are three different sort of realms of approach or impact of the possibility of swabhava. And the first is really all about what is swabhava, and the ontological and the cognitive is like, well, how does it govern our conscious and unconscious experience, and how can we change that experience by understanding the the ignorant, by understanding the incorrect assumption of swabhava, and then the real focus for us is in this particular course, the cognitive is more like, how do we unravel the mistaken conceptions? How does it impact us? How does it determine our experience, our belief in swabhava? And so here we'll focus primarily on what we think swabhava is. And he comes up with three types: essence swabhava, substance swabhava, and absolute swabhava. And claims that these types are, he says these were identified by Chandrakirti, who's one of the main proponents of the Madhyamaka view, in his famous commentary on Nagarjuna's root verses on the middle way. Chandrakirti's text is the Prasana Pada. Essence, substance, and absolute swabhava. And the essence is, what is the property that makes something what it is? And the substance swabhava is how do we say, is is more the characteristics, the characteristic of what something is, how it exists, whereas essence is that it exists. And the third is this notion of absolute swabhava, that there's like some notional ideal or constant for every different type of swabhava that exists somewhere. And he finally collapses the absolute into the essence swabhava. And interestingly, he says that Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna focus almost exclusively on substance swabhava. And we should talk a little bit about what these are, and then why they focus on substance swabhava. And the way that I ended up trying to understand essence versus substance is that essence could be applied to any phenomena, that there's some quality, some feature, characteristic that is what something is. And that makes things what they are, or by virtue of which things are. We identify something as that. And this can apply in a very sort of conceptual and general way to any type of phenomena, whereas substance swabhava applies specifically to this, or sort of is in correlation with this idea that there are essential existence, where versus that those essential, I shouldn't use the word essential, that they are like root or primary, that's the term the author used, that's a good term, they're primary existent phenomena out of which the universe is then constructed by combinations of those. So we get in this scheme the dharmas, the list of dharmas are the primary existence. And as I referred to earlier, we had many classes and discussions on earlier, somehow those primary existence, the dharmas, congregate together and produce these so-called medium-sized dry goods of our world. But also the wet goods and the large objects and the small ones. So I don't know why that phrase is focused only on dry goods and medium-sized ones, but it seems to be a philosopher's term for like the things that we interact with, like tables and chairs and stuff.
It's a
So
fancy way of saying stuff.
stuff or things, yeah. So let's spend some time right there of like the difference between essence swabhava and substance swabhava. Chris, do you want to start and talk some about that?
Yeah, so I think the essence about, the stock example is the heat of fire. And Westerhoff cites Chandrakirti in interpreting Swabhava as essence. Let's see. Okay, so this is difficult because I'm referring to the paper book version versus the PDF. So I'm gonna try and figure out where in the PDF this quote is. It's at the beginning. And if this is just too clunky,
I'll try to
um,
do that on the PDF. Why don't you do the book and I'll try to find the PDF version.
yeah, sure. Okay, so the quote from Chandrakirti is, "For in common usage, heat is called the swabhava of fire because it is invariable in it.
So top of page 172.
The same heat, when apprehended as water, is not swabhava because it is contingent, since it has arisen from other causal conditions." I'll just keep reading. Heat is a property that is always instantiated by fire, and for Chandrakirti at least, every instantiation of fire is also an instantiation of heat. Water, on the other hand, can either be hot or cold, and requires some special conditions apart from being water to heat it up. Although not stated explicitly, the notion of essence swabhava also appears to include a modal element. If fire lost the property of heat, it would no longer be fire. Water, however, can cool down and still remain water. And this is similar to, I think, how the Abhidharmists were conceiving of Swabhava as section, yeah, as the sort of defining characteristic of a dharma, not necessarily connected with its ontological status, how it exists in the superstructure of the universe, but merely the thing by which it can be most readily distinguished from other dharmas. Substance, on the other hand,
And just briefly,
yeah.
this is in 2.1.1 for those using the digital version of the book. Sorry.
Substance, on the other hand, feels like a much more serious, a much more serious category, philosophically speaking. It's not just we could think of essence swabhava as the way things exist, and substance swabhava as how they exist, where they exist, what makes them exist at all.
Can you say that again? The way they exist versus how they exist?
Yeah, sort of, their characteristic versus like the sort of mere fact, the baseline fact of their existence. What distinguishes them? What distinguishes a thing that exists from a thing that doesn't?
And which one is the baseline?
The the how they exist,
The substance.
the substance. That's the baseline. And
It's
what we're going to get into as we try to unpack substance is whether or not that distinction is really all that tenable.
it's interesting because the baseline, I think, at least for me, I would have assumed that the essence swabhava is the baseline. But it seems that the essence swabhava is a little bit more conceptual, and that this is the nuance of the terminology. And those of us that have gone through uh, courses or readings on emptiness, the stages of emptiness of self and phenomena, in the way it's presented in the Gelugpa tradition, may have been exposed to like a hierarchy of the understanding or the projection of a self or an essence as being um, substantial or intrinsic. And I'll try to bring that back in a subsequent class so we see that. But anyway, sorry to interrupt, Chris. Keep going.
So this is, let's see, on the top of my page 24, Derek, if you want to find it in the PDF. Primary existence constitute the irreducible constituents of the empirical world. Secondary existence, on the other hand, depend on linguistic and mental constructions for their existence. For the Sarvastivadin, primary existence encompass primarily partless moments of consciousness, out of which would be constructed secondary existence, for example, medium-sized dry goods such as tables and chairs.
So this is the top of 173. And let's pause there. So for Sarvastivadin, primary existence encompass primarily partless moments of consciousness.
We talked about this earlier. We think he this is a typo, and he probably means partless particles
And moments of
and
consciousness.
moments of
And
consciousness,
partless moments of consciousness. Yeah.
out of which would be constructed secondary elements, for example, medium-sized dry goods, such as tables and chairs. Both classes of objects were taken as existence, but only the primary ones were assumed to possess swabhava. So I think it's a good moment to pause here. Um, there's a historical dimension to this. We've been spending a lot of time trying to unpack the Abhidharma notions of Dharma's primary existence, how Swabhava relates to Dharma, how that relates to atoms, and so on. Um, but I think that we could approach this on a more formal level of just the idea of some sort of baseline, some sort of stuff that the universe is made out of. And I think that without getting um, too anachronistic about it. It's important to understand how this relates to our common sense notions of the world and what is called naive realism, um, how we habitually view the world as existing, and what we habitually view it to be made out of.
I'm remembering that when I've been trying to understand this in the past, it helped me to think about when we look at the chart of dharmas, we have matter, mind, mental factors, and then non-associated phenomena. And the non-associated phenomena was this fuzzy group of like um, birth, subsistence, and cessation or death, life force, things like syllables and time and space and gender, words, also like a hodgepodge of like sort of basically what we would call conceptual labels for the way phenomena, essential properties, function. And so in my mind, the essential aspect of Swabhava would apply to like all dharmas, as well as the phenomena that they comprise. Whereas the substance Swabhava would really gets limited to the dharmas of matter, mind, and mental factors. And it excludes the dharmas of the non-associated formations. And that is the distinction of Sautrantika versus Sarvastivada, which is a little bit detailed, but I find it helpful to think in that way, that substance Swabhava is the essence, really sort of like the essence of the sort of hardcore dharmas that you can experience and identify.
I think the what was the clearest definition for me that he gives, that he says isn't found explicitly formulated in Nagarjuna, but is prominent in later Indian and Tibetan commentarial literature, is findability under analysis. So if we think back to the questions of Melinda and the chariot, so under analysis, the chariot isn't findable. All we can find are the axle and the wheel and so on and so forth. You could then take the wheel and, break that down into, well, the wood and the metal, and then, for each thing, taking it down and down, the wood's made of tree cells, and the cells are, there's water, and, water's got hydrogen. Eventually, the idea is you'll reach a bottom. And that's what Swabhava is going to be. And that bottom is going to look very different for the Abhidharmists as it does for us. But the same sort of structural criticism is going to apply.
And the funny thing about that, which is a very good way of getting a handle on it, but that idea of findability ends up resolving to phenomena that are not observable.
Right.
It's, i.e., like, are they really findable? But it's like logically findable almost.
Peter.
Hi. Um, so I find this very difficult to, if I have to hold more than one thing in my head, I have trouble, and there's sort of a couple of balls in the air. But in reading through the text, there were two things that gave me a little bit of a thread, even though it kind of slipped out of my hands like spaghetti. But one was he said the essence of Svabhava is more sort of epistemological, whereas the substance Svabhava is more ontological. So that there's this play of that. And so that was sort of like a helping starting point of trying to see the distinction he was drawing between these. And then what sometimes seemed to be almost getting it was when he said, well, with essence Svabhava and substance Svabhava, it's each case you're making a distinction between what is not by Svabhava. And that distinction is made in two different ways for each case. So for the essence Svabhava, it's what is not shared by this object with other things. That's its essence Svabhava. And he says that what he means by not shared is how can you tell the difference? And that's where the epistemological comes in. Is how can you distinguish? Elsewhere in the text, he says it's the thing that's inherent to that and not inherent to other things. And then in the substance he was, what I was getting from it, he's saying, well, the main distinction between by Svabhava or not in the substance case is whether they're parts or not, whether it's composite or not. And so those are they really are different kind of things, and it's kind of that's how I was kind of that's where I ended up trying to sort it out in my little head.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. I think those are really helpful ways of understanding these. The one thing I would say is that I think that I don't think he's trying to make the claim with essence swabava that it's defined entirely in terms of things that it's not, because I do think he wants to say that you could take you could take a fire atom and maybe there's a universe where there's only that fire atom, that it would still have the swabava of fire. Right. So even though there's nothing else to distinguish it against, it still has its essence that is sort of self-contained.
Yeah, except you're kind of being a little tricky there because you're making a conceptual thing where there's nothing else. So it's I don't know.
Sure, but I'm just appealing to what philosophers would call modal logic as a way of is trying to distinguish it, trying to distinguish the fire as being sort of a essential quality of the thing itself, rather than something that's defined uh, by its relationship with other things. And he talks about nominal nominal there's a
N-
nominal distinctions.
numinal.
um, like he talks about, we can distinguish northern England is from southern England, uh, as a nominal distinction between the two. But if for some reason southern England was swallowed up by the sea, that wouldn't change anything of how northern England exists. It would just change how we refer to it.
What about other people? Any what reactions, Emily?
I had a question, I guess, that I jotted down. Because I could be totally off base here. It seemed to me like the essence swabava that felt like things existing on in a relative way. And then the substance swabava felt more like trying to say things existed in an ultimate way. And that was part of why Nagarjuna doesn't worry himself so much with the essence swabhava. And it's because that felt very much like, okay, we can all kind of just generally agree that this is a helpful way to talk about things. That's the essence swabhava. And the problematic, and that's why it's the epistemological one. And really the problem here is trying to say things exist on a more ultimate ontological level. But I don't know. That maybe is an oversimplification or a misread, or I'm jumping ahead to like a sort of Shantarakshita um, view. I'm not sure.
I think that sounds right to me. And I think one of the hairy things that we're going to come up against is the problem of understanding what substance swabhava is without the essence swabhava. So what could fire be without heat? Uh,
The funny thing is that he collapses the absolute swabhava into essence swabhava, which makes the essence swabhava seem much more like an absolute versus the substance is more of a um, relative, or the way that the relative is construed in the earlier traditions. We don't have absolute and relative. We have genuine and like artificial. And those things that are artificial are can be taken apart either physically or by analysis, and those that are genuine cannot be taken apart by analysis or physically. But they seem to flip around. Um, but Unless other comments. Otherwise, one of the key issues that it boils down to is the nature of a substance, swabhava. Sorry, the nature of dharmas that are said to have substance, swabhava, and or the way that substance, swabhava, is conceived or portrayed in phenomena. In the Abhidharma tradition, we have this notion, very strong, clear presentation that real dharmas are impermanent, not permanent, and they are completely dependent on causes and conditions. And then we have Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti presenting Swabhava as being unchanging and not dependent on causes and conditions. And so the question is, are they basically misconstruing the Abhidharmas, or are they, or are the Abhidharma, does the Abhidharma presentation sort of say one thing and believe another, so to speak? Are they like really believing things are one way, but then describing them in another way? Chris, you want to?
I think just to put it another way, are there sort of implicit metaphysical assumptions that the Abhidharmikas are making that they don't necessarily acknowledge?
Implicit assumptions that they have that they're not really aware of or
They're not
expressing.
disclosing.
They're not disclosing. And strangely, those implicit assumptions are actually contradictory to what their stated assumptions are.
And I think this is why you have some scholars claiming that Nagarjuna is actually engaging not in a new movement, but is sort of reforming. He's an Abhidharma reformer. He's just trying to tidy up the system and tie up the loose ends.
As opposed to destroying it.
As opposed to destroying it.
I can't see how it can be tidying up when he's thrown
Yeah,
out.
that's like saying our president is just tidying up democracy.
Well, I think the way he can be construed as doing, similar to what Emily was saying, is just saying, sure, the Abhidharma project is a useful and helpful means of talking about the world and a skillful means for deconstructing notions of the self, but that it doesn't work on the ultimate level, and that's actually fine. What's not fine is the claim that dharmas are ultimately existent. But if we can take that claim out of the system, if we can, and the claim that causality is ultimately existent, if we can just remove existent claims from the system, it'll be a lot more useful for us.
Thank you. That is very much the crux of the issue. It seems that once you claim that anything is real, that there's some sort of real thing, then you have to explain it somehow. And it becomes ridiculous, like contradictory to any explanation becomes self-contradictory, it seems. Robert.
It feels like we're circling back to emptiness. And this just is another way, it's just more different jargon for emptiness.
Well, that definitely is the objective of the critique of Nagarjuna and his followers.
And really their innovation here, right? I mean the Abhidharmikas, and Derek, you know more about this than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong, but their notion of emptiness was really mostly about the emptiness of persons. Um, And Nagarjuna is going to take that significantly further and use the same tools that the Abhidharmikas use to demonstrate the emptiness of persons to demonstrate the emptiness of phenomena and, the whole shebang.
Right. Exactly. And which then kind of goes back again because we circle back because if phenomena is empty, then well, the phenomena of my body is empty. And so the whole shebang is empty again. Even emptier. Um, but the implicit bias that we seem to have, or I seem to have, that I'm constantly reminding myself in my practice, is that the stuff out there isn't really all that solid. But my bias is that it is. That's why I get upset, because
So,
I think it's real.
so one of the things that possibly could happen is that the notion of emptiness then becomes, sort of like the Madhyamaka view corrects an excess in the Abhidharma view or an incorrect means of expression. And is there some way of incorrectly expressing emptiness that then needs to be refined? Like, is emptiness an object of experience? Is it unchangeable? Is it findable? Is it observable? These things become the crux of the next evolution in this progression. So let's go to Peter, and then let's come back to some more of the article, Peter.
Yeah, so for this part of this little conversation, I really want to believe that Nagarjuna he has the path in mind here. Can you hear me? Because I don't know if my internet is stable or not. Oh, okay. So yeah, Nagarjuna he has the path in mind, and if one goes far on the path, then this distinction of whether or not dharmas are really existent or not will become more important than for maybe us who are at the beginning of the path. Like there is the story of the arhats having heart attacks when they listen to the Heart Sutra. So there's real practical implications for the path itself in this, and I at least want to believe that that's where Nagarjuna was coming from also in this, not just from mere philosophical interest. But it has to do when one is maybe more refined, that it becomes more important the more refined one gets in order to have this clarification about the existence or non-existence of dharmas.
Good. So let's continue with further fleshing out these notions of swabhava, and in particular, swabhava as being dependent or independent is one of the crucial issues. And the author goes through different types of dependence in an effort to clarify the fallibility of the notion of swabhava. He identifies existential dependence and notional dependence. And he brings in an unusual term, fifth. And in particular, the Gelugpa tradition he references has a very nice way of dividing up these types. The notional dependence is not really a significant issue. It's conceptual and very relative. The real one is the existential dependence. In what sense do phenomena or swabhava existentially depend on other swabhava? And he goes through three varieties of this identified in the Gelugpa tradition: causal, mereological, and conceptual. Do you want to go through these, Chris, or anything that I've skipped over in the interim?
Yeah.
Derek, what page are we on? Where do we end? Where are we now?
That's a good question. What page? I sort of skipped ahead topically. I am in, let's see, on page 175. Or actually in the bottom of 174, he identifies the dependence relations. In order for us to understand this ontological conception of substance, swabhava, it's important to get a clear idea what is precisely meant by the dependence of an object upon it or on another one. And first distinguish two notions of dependence. Very important to separate existential and notional. And notional, Chris just talked about with northern and southern England and his plan to take over southern England with water. And then, let's see, the three types are in the next paragraph. The Gelugpa tradition, so on page 175. Three varieties are distinguished: causal, mereological, and conceptual. So causal is seen as the coarsest understanding of dependent arising and associated with Vaibhashikas or Varstavadins, Sautrantikas, and Chittamatras. Where does he say? Let's see. So on 175, that third full paragraph. In the later Gelugpa commentarial tradition, three varieties are distinguished, which I just stated, altogether postulating the dependence of an object on a basis of designation, a designating mind, and a term used to designate the object as the conceptual. Causal, when an object depends for existence on cause and conditions; mereological, when an object depends on parts; and conceptual, when it's the process of conceptual designation. These dependence relations are supposed to stand in a qualitative and doxographical hierarchy. Causal is seen as the coarsest understanding of dependent arising and is associated with Vaibhashikas and Sarvastivans. So the Buddhist schools, these are the Buddhist schools that present causal dependence of phenomena that possess swabhava: Vaibhashika, Sarvastivana, Sautrantika, and Chittamatra. And the ones missing from the list are, of course, the Madhyamakas of both flavors, Swatantrika and Prasangika. And then he says, mereological dependence is a bit more subtle. The Swatantrika Madhyamakas are assumed to understand emptiness in terms of both causal and mereological dependence. The most subtle understanding, which incorporates all three forms of dependence, is associated with the Prasangika Madhyamakas. Now, he doesn't really flesh this out here, but
Yeah, I thought this was just such an interesting kind of hanging paragraph that he doesn't really unpack, why these different traditions are associated with these, and even what it would mean to understand dependent origination with one or more of these types of dependence relations.
Yes, indeed. And this was what I was referring to earlier, of this hierarchy of understanding of emptiness, that Emptiness is initially understood as the absence of causal dependency, phenomena which are causally dependent, and then the absence of phenomena that are dependent upon their parts is the higher school of Svatantrika, and that only the Prasangika undoes, undermines conceptual dependence, which is going back to our earlier scheme, is notional or conceptual existence or svabhava. And we see this presented in a progressive order in going through the understanding of selflessness of phenomena in particular, where first phenomena are understood to be very clunky, and we overcome their clunkiness because the struggle to define what a phenomena is and how phenomena can interact and still be what they are is illogical. And then, there must be something there. If there's something there, it must depend on its parts. Is sort of like you retreat on each stage, like you give up ground. Like, okay, yeah, that clunky level of svabhava is being causally interdependent. It doesn't hold water, but there's phenomena that exist because they're the essence of larger phenomena. And then that doesn't hold water for the logics that we've been through of partless particles and so forth. And then finally there's this subtle conception of, well, there's something there. We wake up and there's something there. And we don't, it's not, it doesn't have a logical structure to it. It's just this sense of innate belief in existence. Anyway, it's this little stab, and hopefully we'll come back to these. I'll share some literature, but anyway, Emily, and then we'll move on to more topics that are repeating through the chapter.
I just want to state what now feels obvious, but didn't when I first read this. It's not really clear the way he wrote this paragraph, but what this is saying is that these are the different levels to which these schools refute this level of existence rather than believe in it. Like, with the way it's written, it almost sounds like they uphold these different levels. And that's what I was so thrown off by with this paragraph. But what you just said, Derek, made it much more clear. Yeah.
You clarified it further that the earlier schools overcome the belief in entities that are dependent on each other because they're dependent. Yet there's still a belief in the ultimate particles. That the earlier phase of dependency is phenomena in the more like the consumable dry good fashion, which these lower schools overcome. And then there remains this belief that, well, phenomena are based on these ultimate building blocks, and the Svatantrika overcomes that. And yet the Svatantrika has as we'll see later, the Svatantrika has from the later school point of view, a flawed understanding of relative truth, which the Prasangika eliminates. But it's an oddly presented matrix there, and maybe best to stay with the main topic and continue with that.
So if we want to turn to some of the arguments that he uses against Svabhava, he has a few. And let's begin by looking at the property argument, which we sort of hinted at earlier. which is going to be at the bottom of page 178. I'm trying to find a section number. It's a little ways into section 121, substance swababa. And there's sort of a all caps the property argument. One problem with the assumption of primary existence endowed with substance swabhava becomes evident once we analyze them in terms of the familiar distinction between individuals and properties. According to the classic Buddhist ontology, there are different kinds of primary existence, the Mahabhutas, earth, water, fire, wind, which are distinguished by different qualities. This list is sometimes enlarged to a list of 6 elements or dhatus by adding space or consciousness. It is this list of 6 upon which Nagarjuna's account in chapter 5 of the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas is based. The problem he discusses, however, is independent of our willingness to assume the existence of primary fire atoms and so forth. It arises because whenever we assume that there are different categories of primary existence, whenever we assume that there are different categories of primary existence distinguished by different properties. I'll keep reading. We can easily conceive of ordinary individuals as lacking some qualities which they in fact possess. For example, we can conceive of a red apple as lacking the property of redness and being green instead. In the case of primary existence, however, this is not possible. If we abstract the property of heat from the fire atom, there is nothing left, unless we believe in a propertyless bare particular, which could act as the individual instantiating the property of heat.
Yeah, so why don't we pause there for a minute and unpack? Do you want to unpack that last paragraph a little and just think about a red apple lacks the property of redness?
Sure. We could assume that by some accident the red apple turned out green. Maybe the tree didn't get the right nutrients, but there's some idea that it's the same apple. Maybe the apple got like in Alice in Wonderland where they're painting the rosebuds red. It could we could assume the color could change without the thing itself changing.
Yeah, or maybe red apples don't turn red until a certain phase
Until they
of
become ripe.
maturity, right?
Right.
Something like that. But they're still a so-called red apple.
Yeah. Well, there's still a so-called apple, which happens to be red or, whatever color it turns out to be. We might also, and I don't know if the Buddhists would agree with this, or the Abhidharmikas would agree with this. We could also say that if you lack the, red is a feature of having trichromate vision that not all creatures possess, and yet that doesn't change anything about the apple itself.
The fact that the apple doesn't have trichromate vision.
Yeah. Right.
So by the way, above this on the same page of 178, he lists these 5 famous fivefold classification of arguments against ways of rejecting substance swabhava, which many of us have been through, if not all of us, the diamond slippers and so forth. So then the property argument, which one of these is the property? Do you want to correlate these?
I was actually trying to avoid that.
Yeah,
it's number 5. The neither one nor many argument will be discussed below. I will also examine 2 arguments against the existence of substance swabhava, which we find in Nagarjuna's works, but are not included in the classification given above: the property argument and the argument for change. Okay, so I guess it's not in this list of 5.
Yeah, 2 additional ones, making a total of 7. Okay, good.
Yeah. So this is the director's cut. So yeah, how did do people have any thoughts about this distinction between primary existence and properties? And we could say individuals and properties. Does that make sense? Great.
Why don't you explain it?
Well, I think we have then. So you've got this idea of the apple, and then redness is a property that the apple instantiates.
So it's possessed
It's possessed. Hmm.
by a particular phenomena. It possesses a particular quality. And
And what the question that this is sort of pointing at is, are there individuals without properties? Is there some basic stuff that possesses the property of apple that then also possesses the property of red, or is apple where the buck stops?
so, which of those are dharmas? If we look at our list of dharmas, is the property a dharma or is the possessor a dharma?
Well, isn't there a
What do
question of
people?
whether those are in fact separate?
There's totally that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure
But
that
this,
Abhidharmikas will
they think
consent
it's
to
separate.
this distinction. But they do. I mean, they do have the idea of water being warm, and the warmth of water not being an essential quality of the water.
Right, whereas heat is an essential quality of fire.
Right. Mary Beth,
Yeah.
Could you just relate that to me?
you
Like,
personally?
yeah, like, are you or like a person? Like, is the possessor part the part that might get the karma, and then the characteristic part not? Or I mean, like if we're gonna talk about it with regard to the apple, then doesn't the same argument have to work when we apply it to a self or a person somehow? Like, what
Well,
is
yeah, I
me and
think
what are
this.
my characteristics, and is there a difference?
I think this maps really well onto common sense notions of the self. Like whenever you have the thought, well, I could have been an astronaut. There's an idea that like whatever my current life circumstance is somewhat incidental, but there's this thing called me that I can plug into a totally different scenario that persists in the scenario where I'm an astronaut. It's just so with the apple, there's an idea. Well, it could have been a green apple. Emily.
I mean, I guess my question here depends on what system we're talking about, but um, isn't the idea that everybody in the whole Buddhist world agrees uh, that there's no self, but the disagreement is whether there are existent dharmas and that those are distinguished?
Yes. Well, I mean, unless you were talking about like Puglavada, but
Right.
that's for another time. Um, the I think the idea is that you're pointing at is do these same argument and Nagarjuna I think wants to make this case. Do these same arguments that we use to deconstruct the self also necessarily deconstruct fundamental existence?
Right. And Nagarjuna would say yes,
Nagarjuna would say absolutely yes.
but the Abhidharmikas might say no. It's a little bit unclear, right? Or no, they would say no.
They would say no. Or at least Nagarjuna's presentation of them. Um,
Right. But they would still say, like, Mary Beth, to your question, the Abhidharmikas would still say that there's no cohesive self, like me, whether we're talking about the personality characteristics, like the acquired elements or the innate elements. They would say both of those don't exist, right? Abhidharmikas. Okay. Derek gave a thumbs up, so.
That's right. So the Pudgalavadins, by the way, it always comes up, and my understanding of these folks is that they press the issue of in what sense are we saying that there is no self of persons, and they're saying by they're saying that there is a notional relative self that we can talk about, we do all the time, and that's helpful to acknowledge for the cultivation of the path. And by doing so, they're identifying that that's not what is being refuted. What's being refuted is an intrinsically real, ultimate or essential or absolute sense of self.
Thanks for that, Derek.
Right. They're not refuting our coping mechanisms,
Right.
our organizational principles.
So yeah. So this idea of like a bare particular I find fascinating, and not quite clear. Was hoping we could sort of talk it through.
Right. So I'm just going to keep reading from where I was, which is going to be the this quote that's at the top of 179 from Nagarjuna. So if we, this is right above that quote, if we abstract the property of heat from the fire atom, there is nothing left unless we believe in a propertyless bare particular, which could act as the individual instantiating property of heat. Nagarjuna considers this possibility in the case of space. No space is evident prior to the characteristic, the lakshana of space. If it existed prior to the characteristic, it would follow that it was without the characteristic. Thus, assuming that space existed first without its characteristic and only later acquired it, in the same way that an apple can exist without the property of redness, which is acquired only once the apple is ripe, commits us to the existence of a propertyless bare particular. This is due to the fact that unlike ordinary objects such as apples, primary existents have their properties essentially. Since the only essential characteristic of space is its particular space nature, space without this characteristic is like a knife without a handle which has lost its blade. There is nothing left. For Nagarjuna, introducing bare particulars at this point is not an option. He claims that an object without characteristics is not to be found anywhere. Why does Nagarjuna reject the notion of a bare particular? Bare particulars do not appear to be straightforwardly contradictory entities. In fact, their existence is postulated by metaphysicians claiming that individuals must be more than just a bundle of properties. The problem seems to be this. Let us assume that there was indeed a bare particular left over once we abstracted the property of heat away from the fire atom. Assume furthermore that this particular would have its nature, its bare particularness, intrinsically and essentially. In this case, heat could not be the swabhava as well, since something cannot have two different swabhavas. Its further characterization by heat would therefore be superfluous for establishing its status as the primary existent. Alternatively, we could assume that this bare particular did not have its nature intrinsically and essentially, but depended on something else. We could then ask whether this something else has it as its essential property, as its property essentially, and so on. In this case, we get into a regress, which the opponent of Nagarjuna has to terminate somewhere, since he wants to establish that some objects, i.e. the true primary existence, exist by swabhava and are therefore not dependent on anything else. We therefore end up at the first possibility again, as the various properties that make up the supposed swabhava of the primary elements, fire, water, and so forth, are superfluous in characterizing these foundational objects as primary existence, since these objects are already existent as such. So I think the idea is that if you have a bare particulate, a bare particular to which the property of heat, which acquires the property of heat, there's the question of where the property of heat comes from. Okay, so it must come from something else, so it must come from another particulate that instantiates it. And this sets up this regress where the heat has to be introduced into the system somewhere, but if the system is built out of bare particulates how do you get it in there? Skipping ahead a bit. This is the second paragraph on page 180. The proponent of bare particulars might now be inclined to say that all this shows is that the pluralist theory of the six elements was mistaken, and that we have to assume that there is only one kind of primary existent, namely the bare particulars having their intrinsic nature intrinsically and essentially. They constitute the pure stuff of the world, which is then flavored by such properties as heat, wetness, etc., in order to form fire, water, and other atoms. Bracketing the difficulty of how these different bare particulars are to be told apart, the most important problem with this is that Nagarju's opponent also wants to argue that the primary existents are mind independent, and they exist whether or not any conscious beings are around. So this is something that Derek was getting at earlier. But while this has certain plausibility for objects that can be distinguished by their properties, such as the four Mahabhutas or the fundamental particles of contemporary physics, a bare particular from which all the characteristics have been abstracted away bears the mark of the mind's handiwork. Bare particulars are nothing we are immediately or even mediatedly acquainted with. They are conceptual fictions, theoretical entities introduced in the course of constructing an ontological theory, but hardly anything we would suppose exists from its own side, independent of conscious minds. So the idea is that in attempting to find the bedrock of existence and sort of running out of qualities that we could conceivably say exist, we've just invented an elaborate abstraction.
Oh, Cynthia.
And it seems like in some ways it's kind of obvious also because it would be something that that essentially because in the relative reality we do experience through characteristics, right? And so there's really no way you could experience these bare particulars.
And I think again, you don't escape this problem of from where do the bare particulars obtain non-bare qualities?
Yeah, I mean that doesn't make any sense, but just the whole notion that they could be that way, as you say, it sort of really pushes it into the abstract as opposed to the experiential.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a similar structural problem that we see, all throughout Madhyamaka reasoning. The idea of the incomprehensibility of a partless particle forming, a three-dimensional world. If the particle has no dimensionality, how by stacking them up do you get dimensionality? If a bare particular has no particularity, how by stacking them up do you get particular things?
The description reminded me of how apparently McDonald's makes its French fries, which is apparently they take the potatoes and they bleach them like in some sort of substance that completely eliminates their taste. And then they add like 17 chemicals or something to give them their unique flavor, give them back their taste. So they're like bare particulars that are then adorned with qualities. But somehow that image came to mind. But so the alternative, what's the alternative to particulates, the bare particular syndrome?
This is something that in contemporary metaphysics are called tropes. And so the idea is, on one hand, you have particulars without properties, and the alternative is properties without particulars.
Yeah. And so how does that relate to the notion of swabhavas?
So in this case,
do they fit into one category or the other?
I think you could say so. Instead of a fire atom, okay, a particular fire atom. You've just got this sort of floating trope of heat. Um, and the problem is, okay, so how are you going to distinguish it? How do you say that it exists at one point and not another? And the way to do that seems to say, okay, well, what's next to it? So we've got the trope of heat is in a situation surrounded by these other tropes, and collectively they make up the flame of the candle. And that's different from the flame of another candle because there are a different arrangement of tropes around the other candle. And the problem with this is that the whole notion of swabhava is that it's supposed to be a characteristic that can stand alone, and all you've done is defined it in terms of relations, a relational arrangement.
Yeah, dependency. It's a dependent phenomena instead of an independent phenomena. But it's a so it's a like a mereological dependence, or sort of a
Hmm.
conceptual dependence instead of a causal. So the Abhidharmakas had they accepted causal dependency. Um, that phenomena were dependent causally. That's what bhavas were, but they were not dependent mereologically on parts, right? And how does that relate to tropes?
If I
I
can just finish.
You were saying
Okay,
this was, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, finish up. You're implying that will clarify things for us.
Um, we'll see about that. Um, okay, so this is going to be at this is the last paragraph on before the Mariological argument on page 181. Given that Nagarjuna regards these options as exhaustive, right? So the two options are one, bare particulars, and the other option is floating tropes. Given that Nagarjuna regards these options as exhaustive, he considers the above difficulties as a reductio of the notion of a primary existent. For him, the primary existence and the properties they instantiate have to be regarded as existentially dependent on one another. If the properties did not exist, there would be no particulars to characterize, and in the absence of the particulars, there would be no characterizing properties. But in this case, a fundamental property of primary existence is no longer fulfilled, namely that these existents should be independent of all other objects. Depending on for their existence on the properties characterizing them, the supposed primary existence cannot produce the foundation for a hierarchy of dependence relations. It therefore turns out that the only satisfactory way of understanding the relation between primary existence and their properties has to deny that they are primary existence in the first place.
If you deny primary existence, how do you support properties? It's sort of like, do you discard the baby with the bathwater?
I think that's exactly the point.
Yeah. Cynthia, I think, had a comment. It passed.
Yeah, I don't think it's that
But
significant.
what I'm getting is that is everything conspires to make everything.
Yeah, they all got together and they're totally in cahoots.
Well, it's just you can't pull one thing out of it. It's
The whole
all
thing falls apart, yeah.
it's unity,
But how does their differentiation?
Well, that's where mind comes in.
Yeah, it is leading there, isn't it?
Mary Beth?
Well, it just sounds like you made properties not real.
Well, I think he's saying that properties can't exist without particulars, and particulars can't exist without properties. That
But But it's sort of like the distinction of particular and property dissolves, and there's, you know, some other, you have to come up with another term like trope or something. Because particular properties without particulars doesn't make sense.
I I felt like you just made both of those things kind of go away. No
Yeah.
particulars and no properties.
Well, I think what he's saying is that the two are completely dependent on one another and they can't be abstracted away from one another in a way that makes any sense.
Right. And so therefore the definitions of them separate as like a particular doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah. It's almost like saying we call it a particular, we call it a property, but neither of those things are,
Separate.
yeah, or
Identifiably
can
separate.
be
Yeah.
distinguished.
Peter.
Hmm. Sometimes with these things, I get a little uncomfortable because it feels like Nagarjuna is setting up a straw man. And so that's not really satisfying. So it has to do, I think, with because I do not know whether he's um, accurately representing the Abhidharma position and pointing out a flaw in that, or if he's actually sort of taking something that's less well defined and building a straw man argument out of that he then demolishes. So if I were the judge sitting in this court, I would have little question. I would have questions for the lawyer Nagarjuna about how he's presenting things.
You would say leading the witness.
Well, from of a purely philosophical point of view, it's almost not even a concern of ours. It's like we're interested in the argumentation and whether we find it persuasive. Whether the arguments he ascribes to the Abhidharmikas relate with the views they actually held is more of a question for the religious historians than for the philosophers. Does
Well,
that make sense?
I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. What you don't get is some kind of argument that you could probably make is that the basis of Nagarjuna's refutation is ill-founded because you could certainly have particulars that have inherent qualities, and that he's making this false distinction about one or the other, but whereas they are just one. So I can't do it off the top of my head, but I could imagine that there could be some kind of say, well, that's the sense here. So then you're creating this false dichotomy that you're then using to refute or something like that. I don't know.
Emily?
It seems to me, though, that whether or not he's setting up a sort of straw man situation with the Abhidharmikas, I did appreciate that Westerhoff pointed out that this is generally how people's brains interact with the world, and that according to, all Buddhist systems, that's the cause of suffering. So it seems to me like regardless of the accuracy, the whether he's being fair to the Abhidharmikas or not, that these philosophical arguments are so important because they become extremely useful in helping practitioners to undermine the way that we all do tend to interact with the world. But Peter, I don't know if yeah, that may be sort of speaking. I may be missing your point somewhat.
No, I think that's helpful because the oxygen or the fresh air was his very last few paragraphs, where he talks about how this relates to experience and sort of the big picture from actually applying these things, and that was where sort of everything is kind of redeemed at that point. So which is sounds a little bit like where you're,
Yeah,
what,
this is the key part of the whole analysis is that whether you call uh, whether you ascribe this to an Abhidharmika or to a materialist or to you and me, this is how our minds habitually operate, and and it seems like Nagarjuna is just like that's his opponent, is the ordinary person, and because the Abhidharmakas were like the main people around, they he sort of pinned it on them, I guess. But it, the later in the article there's or the chapter there's this wonderful presentation of experiments that are done with people of a dot that is placed in different places on the page as an example of this inherent propensity to project thingness where there is no thingness, that you flip the pages and you're convinced that the dot has moved. It's the same dot and it's moved.
And what's
Yes,
also nice is he talks about how that's an evolutionary advantageous thing for humans to have. Where it's not as though we were wandering on the savannah and some evil psychological experimenters came up to us with 2 pages with dots on them, demanding we distinguish. But that a lot of these are sort of a lot of the ways the mind works is incidental to our evolutionary karma. And
incidental
or a result.
essential
It's incidental and related to our evolutionary karma.
Incidental mean like brought about by or dependent,
Yeah, yeah,
causally dependent.
causally dependent. Yeah, not essential, not essentially implying anything about the way the universe is.
Right. Cynthia.
Yeah, this may be kind of obvious and stupid, but it seems like this is where we get into the need to rely on the relative and absolute in order to talk about it, because what we experience is this characteristic thing. That is how we experience through perceiving characteristics and thinking there are things and all of that. That is, and so. And what it seems like they came to is the point where stop trying to explain it. It can't be explained in a logical way with, particles and things and all that. You can't do that. And that's where it seems like the break of relative and absolute has to come into play, right? Because earlier they were trying to define an absolute that logically built up the house of cards. And here it's more like you just kind of recognize, okay, this is the way we experience things. This is what we perceive. This is our habit. But you can't build a logical truth to make it, you have to accept that it's whatever they like to call it, illusory and all those things.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that they're sort of pulling the rug out from it, but or it's like when you pull the tablecloth and the plates are still there. It's like they deontologize the Abhidharma system, but they don't say that changes anything about appearance. The Abhidharma system, in many ways, is an attempt to create an ontological grounding for appearance, to say there's the relative and then the absolute are these dharmas, which are real and unchanging and permanent. Or you can mad lib whatever you want depending on the different Abhidharma system you're using, but there's real stuff at the bottom. The Nagarjuna seeks to take the bottom out, but without necessarily changing the top.
And in doing so, the notion of a so-called relative is merely sort of notional.
Yeah, it's convention. It's consent. It's
Convention is a better term than
that's the
relative.
acceptance of consensus.
Yeah, it's like
But
we can't
also illusory. It
Yeah,
takes on a quality of
yes,
illusory that
yeah,
is somewhat there with the Abhidharma, but there's still an idea that the world of appearance bottoms out somewhere.
yeah.
And for Madhyamaka, it doesn't bottom out anywhere, and that's what makes it so illusory. Peter.
And
So,
last comment, because we are out of time. So
okay. Well, this was actually like a little daydream that I had. I had that. So this, because somewhere way back in some previous class, there was a reading by Wilson Fletcher, and then there was just one line when he mentioned something about Kant. And then, so Immanuel Kant has been like going through my mind the whole time. And I thought, oh, like if Nagarjuna and Kant sat down together for a chat, or actually, the real daydream was Immanuel Kant goes to see Trungpa Rinpoche, and Trungpa says, "Oh, you should go talk to Nagarjuna." And then he arranges that, and then they sit down. And then Nagarjuna says, "Oh, well, here's what I understand your philosophy, and what I see. One thing that you're missing is you have these categories that organize how we conceive things like time and space and causality. You're missing one, which is bhavava. If you put that in, then you'll get a more complete Kantian philosophy. But you're also missing another thing, which is that those categories are not immutable. You can actually undo them, and like we have this tantric practice where you can undo the. It seems to be Svabha seems to be an innate Kantian category, but it's not. You can undo it, and I can show you how. That was my daydream.
I feel like there's like a skit. There's like a skit that needs to be performed at some point.
Okay.
at the Rime Shadra retreat, we'll have the skit
Yeah,
at the end.
when we do the talent show.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Chris. That was great. And
Thank you,
thank
Derek.
you, everyone. Let's dedicate our merit. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara may I free all beings by the confidence of the golden sun of the great east. May the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you, everyone. Great to see you. Thank you for joining in. And we'll see you next week.
Yep.
Take care.
Have a good one.